So thank you.
You're good.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for being here. This case has a lot of public interest, and we determined at this point in time that we would need to have a press conference. The Internal Affairs Division of the Charlottesville Police Department has completed its investigation into the allegations leveraged by Dr. Linda Olson Peebles, the interim minister of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Charlottesville. Those findings were delivered to Dr. Olson Peebles and the church this past Monday, and we have not received any comment back from them. According to Reverend Olson Peebles, a letter which was published on the church website, it was sent to their board and supported by their board of trustees, heavily circulated throughout social media, and then followed up by Reverend Peebles with conducting interviews, news commentary, in which she alleged on October 7th, a church member and a chair of their grounds committee, Walter Hoffman, was walking up Rugby Road to participate in a work party to clean the playground. Just as he reached the edge of the property, a police car pulled up, and an officer asked Mr. Hoffman what was he doing in the neighborhood. The letter further alleged within several minutes, 5 police cars surrounded Mr. Hoffman. Reverend Olson Peebles continued, a neighbor who is a UVA student called to say a black man was walking up the sidewalk in front of her house, suggesting, as some activists have claimed, that, quote, a UVA student weaponized their privilege against a black Charlottesville resident whom that student identified as a threat to their personal comfort when no actual harm was imminent. Olson Peebles continued that the police stated they were concerned about recent break-ins in the neighborhood, and they had a picture of the suspect. The suspect looked nothing like our church member, other than both men are black. Even after the police acknowledged Mr. Hoffman was not a suspect, they still demanded his social security number and identification. One officer even suggested, per Reverend Olson Peebles, Mr. Hoffman walk another way to church. She further asserted that the police only withdrew when another church member, a white lady, concerned there might have been a traffic accident, walked over to investigate the situation. Olson Peebles reported that Mr. Hoffman has faced this discrimination before of walking while black, and that racial profiling and harassment must stop. She insisted that the police department owes Mr. Hoffman an apology, as he needs to feel safe in the church neighborhood. Our Internal Affairs Department, led by Lieutenant Michael Gore, launched an immediate investigation into the allegations upon receiving the complaint. Shortly thereafter, Kate Fraley submitted a complaint on behalf of Mr. Hoffman. The IA personnel involved reviewed the initial 911 call, the radio transmissions from the events, the body-worn camera footage, and interviewed all parties, including Reverend Dr. Linda Olson. I will be releasing the body-worn camera footage in full. Based on the 911 call and the footage, the caller indicated an individual believed to have been a suspect in a recent rash of burglaries had been loitering on their private property most of the morning and had cut through the side of their home and across their private driveway and private sidewalks. The caller described the individual as an African-American man, light-skinned, possibly wearing all brown. Reverend Olson's fourth-hand accounts, repeat, fourth-hand accounts of the events are not remotely supported by the evidence. Of note, the caller does not identify an affiliation with UVA, nor does the 911 audio suggest it is a UVA student merely calling to report a black man who is walking on a public sidewalk. Reverend Olson Peebles then asserted, just as Mr. Hoffman reached the property, he was asked, what were you doing in the neighborhood? According to the responding officer, he was circling the block looking for the suspect when Mr. Hoffman flagged him down. This statement is verified by radio transmissions, the officer's body-worn camera audios, and visuals. The evidence completely refutes Linda Olson people's inflammatory and baseless allegations, and I quote, "Just as he reached the property, they asked him what was he doing in the neighborhood." She further contended within several minutes that the officers surrounded him and only withdrew when a white church member, concerned there had been a traffic accident, walked over to investigate. Once again, our video evidence refutes this baseless, race-baiting claim as body-worn footage, and the white church member who they supplied as a witness indicated several cars were parked on the street, clearly depicting Mr. Hoffman was not surrounded. These allegations are then further refuted by the fact that Mr. Hoffman, in our body-worn camera footage, is observed leading detectives to a garden area of the church to show them his nameplate, and where there was no white lady present, nor is he surrounded. I agree the only legitimate statement in Reverend Olson Peoples and her board made, although taken out of context, was an officer advised Mr. Hoffman to walk another way. That is correct. Mr. Hoffman's route to the church included walking through private property, private backyards and sidewalks, advising him, suggesting that that was not the way to walk would be appropriate. The complaint highlights the power of the community members here seeking to leverage their privilege and self-serving agendas. In jumping on the bandwagon approach, many of this community have adopted without regard for those involved. This point is highlighted by a letter I received on December 3rd, 2020 from Mr. Hoffman stating, "Over the past few months, individuals from, quote, the UUC Church, Seville, Cavalier Daily, and all the other people have it wrong and do not represent me. Mr. Hoffman is correct in his indignation at the predatory manner in which Linda Olson Peoples and her board behaved. Although we have a robust mechanism for reporting concerns involving CPD personnel, Reverend Olson Peoples, the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Charlottesville, allegations were irresponsible and preyed upon national headlines in order to gain the spotlight. Her social media campaign regarding our interactions with Mr. Hoffman were public and unfounded attacks on CPD and CPD officers. This should not be tolerated by this community. It, in fact, directly led to an editorial in the Cavalier Daily that called for the firing of all persons involved, all officers involved, as well as numerous advocacy groups, clergy, and UVA students suggesting the same. And that leads to my final point. There is an aspect of this complaint to which I wholeheartedly agree with Reverend Olson Peoples. Action and accountability are needed. The call to apologize or to be terminated for their actions should start with Reverend Dr. Linda Olson Peoples and their board members who all signed off on this, to include President Lori Craddock, Vice President Elizabeth Breeden, Secretary Beth Yeager Landis, their treasurer Stan Walker, Kelsey Cowger, Brett Cagister, Jim Corin, Pam McIntyre, and Liberty Powers, as well as the many social justice agencies who co-signed in this smear campaign without any more than a fourth-hand account of their encounter. This is all reckless, harmful, and a divisive approach to this incident and the way we are here in Charlottesville. And with that, I'll take a few select questions. Are we going to show you the video? Can we do that?
Do you want to do that now? Yep.
What we're going to do is show you literally edited versions of the 911 tape. They've been edited to blank out personal protected information of a person making the phone calls, and any of those other ones that you could identify who that person was. You will see a short snippets of the body-worn camera footage just for the purposes of here, and then that full footage will be released on our website. 3-minute version will be available for media and posted on our websites as well.
And trying to break into houses and break into our neighbors.
911.
Hi, we have a man who's been loitering on our property and trying to break into houses and break into our neighbors, and he's on the property right now.
What's your address? He said he broke into your neighbor's house?
Yes.
Just now?
No, he broke into their house previously, but he's been loitering on the property.
Okay. Okay, so can you describe him for me?
Yes, he is black, light skin, like medium height.
What is he wearing?
He just walked away.
What is he wearing?
What's he wearing? What's he wearing? He just walked down, like, the side street.
What is he wearing?
We can't see him anymore.
Light shirt, dark shirt,
I
a
think
baseball cap?
all brown. I think he was wearing all brown.
Suspicious activity. Caller says a male broke into her neighbor's house previously, is on the property now. Black male, medium height, wearing all brown. Now walking down Rugby toward Burnley Ave. I got flagged down by a gentleman wearing a brown shirt.
Flagged down by a gentleman wearing a brown shirt. Yeah, if you want to talk to this guy, he was actually down there talking with her. He flagged me down when I drove by. He said he saw her run inside the house and lock the door. So he thought we were looking for him.
Okay.
Yeah. No problem. No, we've had a lot of people. We've had a lot of people breaking into houses over there.
Let's not say that and then walk away.
Nobody said it was you.
Listen, we're talking about. We're talking about 15 and 16-year-old kids. Yeah, okay, but my thing is, if I lived there and somebody walks behind my house every day, it would make me nervous too. Well, the person that they're talking about is cutting and using the sidewalk right in front of their house. Okay, right. So they don't want you walk. You're on their property. When you walk on that sidewalk right in front of their house. Okay, my thing is this. Again, they're freaked out. People are getting there. Okay, and I'm not saying you're not. So if you're freaked out and they're freaked out, and the common denominator is to not walk through there, then why don't we do that?
He's upset because they called because he's black. He says he walks here all the time. He comes to this church. He's been going to this church for the last 10 years. I mean, he matches the description. Brown shirt. Yeah. But he flagged me down.
All right.
he has a trach, so he can't talk.
He's walking off. What are you doing?
Thank you. So we provided those snippets in order for you to see and refute every aspect of the claim that was made. It is clear by the radio transmissions, by the 911 calls, that this is not a case of someone walking while black and being harassed on Rugby Road. In fact, as you hear over and over again, he flagged us down. He asked us to encounter him. We wouldn't have known any of these things had occurred unless Mr. Hoffman engaged us. We were driving around. So to then go further and say we surrounded him, you can see by these videos, you can see police cars parked on the street. He's not surrounded. In fact, he decides to walk away because he has such free access and feels comfortable to do so, to then engage the detective to show them his name and where he's a part of the church. I am disappointed that this community has been led down this path and then done so by an institution that should have high standing in this community, like a church, its boards, and even some of the newspapers and the groups that have reported on this incident without verifying any information other than what they had seen on social media or a post. Couple questions.
You said you received a letter from Hoffman. What is the response that you hope to get from the church following this?
So I received a letter, and Lieutenant Gore also received a letter from him as well. Mr. Hoffman in his letter has basically said, leave him alone. He did not ask for this to be brought into this light, and no one was leveraging his voice on his behalf. That he believed this was just the opposite, and they were lying on him, is what he said to me. Clearly what I quoted you, they do not represent him, and they weren't telling the truth. They didn't have the facts.
Just to verify, no charges resulted from this incident? Like Hoffman wasn't charged, no one else? Just want to make sure.
As you can see in this internal affairs complaint, where he walked away when we said he's clearly not a suspect in a crime, that he flagged us down, there would be no need for a charge.
Also, can I verify the dates of when you opened the investigation and when you closed it?
Lieutenant, do you have those with you? So the email came into me, I believe it was, I can pull it up on my phone. I want to say possibly October 16th or 17th. Thank you. Came in on the 19th. I immediately responded the next morning on the 20th, and we opened an investigation on October 20th in this case. So there was nothing that was swept under the rug, no pressure from media. As a matter of fact, not only were we clear that he was not a suspect, our officers took proactive steps to identify to the rest of the police department he was not the burglary suspect we were looking for. And Chief Mooney, do you want to speak on those proactive steps that we took before a complaint was raised by the church?
Yeah, I just want to be clear that other than cutting through private property, Mr. Hoffman did nothing wrong at all. Our detectives actually had a very good conversation with him that day. Talked about some other routes to go. And after that encounter, the detective went back to his desk and on that same day sent out an email department-wide stating that Mr. Hoffman did nothing wrong and that he is not a suspect in these burglaries. And should you encounter him, to treat him with kindness. We did have a rash of burglaries in that area, and that's why they were up there that day. And Mr. Hoffman is not a suspect and absolutely did nothing wrong that day. And we want to be sure that our officers know that so we can avoid this kind of contact.
Will you be sharing Mr. Hoffman's letters that he sent?
I'm not comfortable sharing those without his permission. What he has been clear about is everyone has been putting his name, and that's what he said, in print. And he's given no one permission to do that. I would not violate his confidence and trust to do that. But we do have the letters, and they will be part of those files. As a matter of fact, when he was texted to say that there would be an extension, his response back was very similar. I'm done with this. When the officers were interviewing him, Lieutenant Gore and his team specifically, they apologized for what he was going through and what he was encountering. And he has said that apology in and itself is enough, which is interesting that he's okay with it when there was nothing that the officers did, and he thought that would be sufficient. He deserves an apology, and so does this community from the church and everyone else who participated in this literally mudslinging without any information. And it is not enough to now say, oh, we were just only interested in them in reviewing their policies. There is nothing in those letters that talk about policies. It talks about racial profiling and harassing as though this was something that we were engaged in.
Chief, we do have Brielle Ensminger from Seville on Zoom who has a question. Brielle, if you can hear me and you're on, go ahead and ask your questions.
Hi. Yeah, I just had a quick question about the church basically saying that there was like a white woman that came on the scene. So just to be clear from the evidence, there was no person from the church that came on the scene. It was just Mr. Hoffman there.
You want to speak to your interviews?
To answer your question, there was a church member that showed up during this encounter, but it was after Mr. Hoffman had already made contact with the officers and walked away and was speaking with them.
Thank you.
Chief Brackney, what do you hope the community can learn from the investigation, the findings, and your message today?
So what I'm hoping is, and what I've said before and recently in some of my discussions, we are not affording anyone the opportunity of grace or patience. We are so comfortable starting to attack each other, whether it's out of frustration, whether it's out of anger, whether it's out of rage. And what I am hoping is that as we have to continue, I'm hoping that we don't always have to continue down this route, right, of having to disprove something, that we would be more informed consumers before we start to retweet these things. And the damage that you do, you may think you're taking a shot at our agency or someone else, but you know what? The persons who are really harmed and traumatized by this are those unwilling participants like Mr. Hoffman, who's been dragged into the center of all of this and used as a pawn for someone else's purposes. What I hope from this community is this. Start to give us a chance. I'm looking at other incidents, and we'll probably have additional press conferences about other incidents that are now out in the social media about our behaviors. And when we're going to have those press conferences, when we finish those investigations, and if we see that this has been a very similar response that has been completely a smear campaign against CPD, because that's the place where you think you can get the highest profile and the best response, we ought to think about what that does to genuine public safety in this community and how we interact. African-American men, black men, have suffered at the hands of law enforcement for decades, for centuries. Why would we want to create even more wedge issues when it doesn't actually exist, or in an incident where it doesn't exist? So the community, I would ask, before you co-sign, before you lend your personal and professional reputation to demand that people are terminated and fired and to apologize, think about how you could use your privilege and your power in a way that could benefit the community instead of tearing it down.
And just to follow up on that, if you don't mind, you mentioned, black people, black men in particular, have distrust and have been, victims in cases. How do you rebuild the trust with that community? Especially if, like you said, there are some conclusions drawn before evidence. How do you rebuild that trust?
So I'm even careful about the word rebuilding trust because there's an assumption there was always trust there. What I am hoping for is a new relationship that we can both agree on how we interact with each other with humility, with dignity, with equity, with justice, with respect. That's what I'm hoping for. And the things that we are doing as a department that lend to that transparency. If you look at our website, we are publishing more data than ever before so that the community can see the outcomes of these cases, what they may look like, We're providing summaries of the interactions. We provide summaries of our use of force. We do that by date or by gender and race of the officer as well as the person who force was used against. We're publishing our policies, investigative detentions now. I've been publishing for well over 2 years, and no one's even interested anymore with an occasional write-up in a newspaper about it. And that's even still slanted, right? It won't even acknowledge the difference between officer-initiated stops and those around 911, because it's much more beneficial to continue to create a wedge between us and the department and those we serve than it is to acknowledge the truth of how this department is making strides really to be that department this community deserves. And we'll answer one more, unless you have one on Zoom that is hand raised. Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about the thought process, both in this case and then in cases going forward, for when you want to actually release the body cam footage and really put out what happened? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So this will be the second incident in which I've released the body-worn camera footage. And in full disclosure, we'll be releasing other ones as well. The criteria I use is if that information is of such a public interest that it is in the best interest of this community to either rectify a wrong or to correct something or correct the story, that if not responding to it causes damage to this community and more damage, that's the criteria I have been using. And also just very intentional, if it is a case in which there is a criminal allegation, working with our Commonwealth's attorney so that we don't jeopardize the investigation. I'm also not willing to put witnesses or victims in harm's way, so I am very careful about those type of interactions. Unfortunately, the church and everyone else brought Mr. Hoffman's name to light, not us. So I didn't have the privilege of being able to protect him the way that I would have liked to. But that is the criterion. You're welcome. All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate you.